Welcome, everyone. We are a little bit early, but we will start the session at 12 o'clock. Okay, perfect. That's 12 o'clock. So we have a few more people that will be joining us, but I think it's probably best for us to kick off. So thank you everyone for joining today's session on how to develop viscous oil in a net zero basin. My name is Karim Shafi. I'm a business advisor at OG UK, and I will be co-chairing today's session with Ravi Adela. So just before we kick off today's session, I would like to go over some housekeeping rules with you all. So if you're not presenting, if I can ask you all to keep your cameras and microphones switched off. And if you do have any questions, then please feel free to use the chat box. We will have a Q&A session towards the end of the presentation where we can review all of the questions. But I would like to let you know that the chat box will be visible to all attendees today. And finally, today's session will be recorded and available on our website.
All right. Hey, myself, Ravi Adala, Subsea Systems Commercial Manager at Baker Hughes. So before we start the session, would like to touch upon the upcoming conferences and the webinars. So you could see a kind of a packed agenda for the SP Aberdeen section over the next quarter and also toward the start of the next year. So we have a sand management, topside, geothermal, CCUS conferences coming up. And also there are set of webinars on the next page, Karim. And these are all the upcoming webinars all around again the Q4 in the next few days, and we all encourage all of you to register, participate, and gain out of these sessions. And besides these conferences and webinars, we also have a monthly sessions within the Aberdeen Net Zero chapter sessions. Karim, if you want to move to the next page, these are the upcoming meetings. So these normally happens on a monthly basis, and we will all keep you posted about these upcoming things. But certainly these are the three main topics over the next few months that we are going to cover under the Aberdeen Net Zero series. So with that, I would pass on to Karim to introduce our speakers and their bios.
Thanks, Ravi. Looking forward to some interesting webinars over the next few months. So I would now like to introduce the speakers for today's session. So first up, we have Steve Brown from Orcadian Energy. Steve is a petroleum engineer with over 40 years of experience, and he is the founder of Challenge Energy, which is an upstream consultancy. And in 2014, Steve also founded Orcadian Energy, where he applied for the pilot field license in the 28th licensing round. And joining Steve is Joel Maisey from Crondall Energy. Joel is a chartered engineer, and he leads the electrical and digitalization aspect of Crondall Energy's technology development, where he focuses on low manning and low emissions floating production systems. So with that said, I would like to hand it over to our presenters for an interesting session. I will stop sharing my screen, and I think, Steve, you've got access to the slides. Perfect, that's up.
Is that up? Very good. Well, thank you for that introduction, Kareem. And I think this is a very timely presentation to talk about how we still need to develop oil and gas in the UK, even as we go through this transition. You know, just as world leaders are about to descend on Glasgow and the UK will face its moment in the sustainability spotlight, the energy needs in the UK have never been more sharply in focus or under pressure. You know, to meet demand, the UK needs a mixed energy supply, and that means a combination of renewables and fossil fuels, with the aim of the former overtaking the latter as we move to a low carbon economy. But we need that energy mix to keep the lights on. Let me just make sure I'm moving through the slides. There we go. So as we build that crucial capacity for renewables, it actually falls on oil and gas producers to decarbonize their production processes as effectively as possible. And the North Sea transition deal, which you see outlined on this slide, made clear the prize, or actually the target, in terms of emissions reduction that the industry had undertaken to deliver. And it said there were really a couple of ways that we could meet that target. And that was to electrify with either power from shore or from offshore renewables. And this story is actually about how you can meet that target with offshore renewables. And what I'll do to begin with is just give a little introduction to Orcadian. Then Joel will introduce Crondall Energy to you. And then I'll talk a bit about the pilot project. It's a polymer flood project. From a petroleum engineering perspective, it's probably the most interesting project in the whole North Sea, but I might be a little biased on that. And then we'll talk about how we've driven down emissions on the development plan we want to put in place for pilot. So that's the structure of the presentation. A little bit about Orcadian, as Kareem was saying. It was founded in March 2014. We actually listed on AIM in July 2021. Our key asset is the pilot field that sits right here in the center of this cluster of licenses on the Western platform. It's got a big audited reserve. Spruill's our reserve auditor, 79 million barrels of proven and probable reserves, a hefty net present value, a pretty decent break-even price. And it's not the end of what we've got in the area. We've got 78 million of 2C resources in Elkie Narwhal and the Blakeney field, and some very interesting exploration upside. So we're a pre-development company. We don't have production. We have a great development project, and we're actually looking for partners to help us deliver on that project. One of our partners so far in this development, though, has been Crondall Energy, and they've made a great contribution to us putting our concept select report together and also to reducing the emissions. So let me allow Joel to introduce Crondall to you, for those of you that don't know them already.
Hi, thanks, Steve. Yeah, so Joel Maisey, just a quick introduction to Crondall Energy. So as Steve said, we're an independent oil and gas consultancy. We focus specifically on floating facilities and subsea developments. And we have a full suite of engineering disciplines to provide that service. So we have a process team, EC&I, marine, naval architecture, subsea and pipelines. And our history has been around delivering full project lifecycle engineering support. So taking a project right from the concept stage through to operations. And we do that through long-term relationships with our clients, such as Steve. And really over the last few years, we've been utilizing our technology subsidiary to drive lower manning and lower emissions. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tools that we have to achieve lower emissions in a bit. Thanks, Steve.
Very good. So let me tell you a little bit about Pilot. It's a great reservoir, absolutely fantastic reservoir. You can see it here in the logs. We're looking at 34-35% porosity, 95% net to gross, 2 to 10 darcies of permeability, just fantastic rocks. And it's really well appraised. Oh, I went a bit too quickly there. It's really well appraised. There's 7 reservoir penetrations, mostly drilled by FINA, actually, for those of you who remember FINA. But Venture also drilled a well on this back in the early 2000s. And there's 2 really high quality 3D seismic surveys over it. This is a Western GECO survey, colored inversion display. And actually you can see the reservoir sands filled with hydrocarbons in blue, turning gray as you go beneath the oil water contact. And then when you pop back up into where there's a little gas cap, you see the cyan, the bright cyan for the gas. But you can see the reservoir pinching out as you go to the west, and thickening as you come down towards the east. There's a lot of oil in place, 263 million barrels, and based on a low salinity polymer flood of the reservoir, we're going to recover 79 million of those. Why are we using polymer? It's because the oil's a bit viscous. It's not terribly viscous, but it's a bit viscous. And there's a variable quality of oil in the reservoir. So in the south, we see a slightly lighter oil, but 15 to API, 160 centipoise. In the north, in the most viscous part of the field, we see viscosities of 1200 centipoise, maybe 12 API. But fantastically, FINA sent out a crew to do an extended well test on a short horizontal well right in the north of the field, 600 odd meters long. That produced 1,800 barrels a day. So we have proven commercial rates in the most viscous part of the reservoir, which is a really important fact. So that's what we have in the field. If this had been a light oil field, it would have been developed years ago. We'd be talking about decommissioning of it now, but it's got a viscous oil in it. And when we first licensed the field, we had ideas of applying thermal techniques. But as we went through the concept select process that the OGA asks you to go through, we opened our minds, looked across all the range of techniques you could use to maximize economic recovery. And we settled on polymer flood as actually giving the best economic result and by far the best emissions result. So, you know, polymer flooding's a really well proven technique. It's been around about 40 odd years. When we first licensed the field though, we thought our viscosity was too high for polymer flood. And what we discovered as we went through the concept select process was that actually there'd been a lot of papers written more recently, some in 2015 or so, that were laying out that you could polymer flood very effectively in much more viscous oils than had previously been considered. So if any of you are doing your screening using the Tabor paper, set that aside. There are more up-to-date papers that tell you that you can polymer flood effectively with oil viscosities up to 5,000 centipoise. And alongside that development, Chevron and now Ithaca had been working on polymer flooding the Captain fields. And Chevron had really blazed a trail for how best to implement a polymer flood offshore. The key is to use an emulsion-based polymer that simplifies the logistics and operational activities. The other really important thing in a polymer flood is to get your well spacing right. It's much better with tighter well spacing. It's actually also much better applied early in field life. This is an interesting little chart that I've taken off the CNRL website talking about Pelican Lake, and it shows for their viscous oil fields, and we think this cartoon is really using data for about a 10,000 centipoise oil. You get some primary production. When you do a water flood, you get this initial curve, that actually that red line shaded beneath it blue. If you polymer flood after the water flood, you get a nice increment to your recovery. But actually, if you polymer flood from the start, you follow this blue line. You're a little bit behind the water flood to begin with because you're injecting a more viscous fluid, but you recover much more. And these two slides here, the two pictures just up here, are ones I use to describe polymer flooding to those who aren't familiar with it. They're both hydrocarbon saturation maps for slabs of core filled with viscous oil, 2000 centipoise oil, and then they're pumping water around it. And what you see in the water flood phase is the water just fingers through the oil and it leaves most of it behind. When you start injecting polymer, and in this case, they're adding about 2,500 parts per million of polymer, so 0.25% polymer. That makes a 25 centipoise water, and the flood front stabilizes, and you get a piston-like displacement of the oil out of the core. And the same happens in the field. And the same happened on the pilot scheme, not the pilot field scheme, but a pilot scheme on the Captain field, which was completed in 2013 and published by Chevron in 2018, just as they approved phase 1 of the Captain polymer flood. And it was focused on a well pair in the southern upper Captain sand. The wells were long horizontals, 125 meters apart. And Chevron started by doing a conventional water flood. So this is cumulative oil versus time. And when you're at point C here, this is after 18 months of water flood, you get a very good initial recovery. Then you start to get water breakthrough. And at this point, Chevron projected in this dotted line how they expected a water flood to develop. And of course, they've got lots of experience of how Captain water floods develop. So this would be a very reliable forecast of how the water flood might have proceeded if that's what they'd done. But at this point here, they started to inject polymer. And what happened was that in a year, they recovered 7 years worth of production. So that's a dramatic acceleration of the water flood reserves. They carried on, they didn't stop at that point. And within 18 months, they'd added to the recovery factor another 16%. So, I mean, this is a tremendously successful case. And for the pilot development, this is an excellent analog. You know, Captain and pilot are actually really very similar. They're roughly the same depth. Pilot's at 2,700 feet, so is Captain, roughly speaking. It's the same porosity, 35% porosity in both. Same sort of permeabilities. Captain's 5 Darcys, we're 2 to 8 Darcys. Same temperature, both at 31 degrees centigrade. And there's an awful lot for us to learn and copy from the Captain polymer flood scheme. So we're very proud to acknowledge, or happy to acknowledge, the great work that Chevron and now Ithaca are doing there. So this is what our development scheme looks like. We're planning to have a lot of wells. So this is 32 wells, or 1,500 meter long horizontals. In the south of the field, where the oil's a bit less viscous, we think the optimum well spacing is around about 150 meters. In the north of the field, where it's a bit more viscous, we're aiming for 100-meter well spacing. So very similar to what was done on the Captain field. Production from the wellhead platform will go to an FPSO, and we'll drill wells through those wellhead platforms with a jackup. One of the keys to maximize your recovery is to minimize your well spacing. And there's an optimum well spacing. And you actually get more recovery if you can really minimize your drilling costs. So drilling from a jackup, not having any complicated subsea equipment is really favored for this type of scheme. And One of the extra elements that we have in our development scheme now is a floating wind turbine. So that's part of how we've significantly reduced emissions in the project, but it's not the only way that we've reduced emissions. So this is what our production profile looks like. It's a pretty short profile. It's a compressed profile. Pilot will produce at about 30,000 barrels a day on plateau, but it's all over within 10, 11 years. So that's actually really good for the economics. We have some follow-on opportunities, and with a bit of exploration success, we could be producing a couple of 100 million barrels from this area. Now, this slide here really summarizes the path we've been on to reduce emissions. You know, if you look at a typical viscous oil, and by a typical viscous oil, what I really mean is I've gone through the original environmental statements for Kraken and Mariner and worked out what the emissions per barrel were. That's around about 30 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. And the North Sea average for producing fields in 2018 was 21 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. When we originally looked at a water flooding pilot, it was very similar to a typical viscous oil. It was around about 25 kilograms per barrel. A steam flood would have been around about 90. But the polymer flood gets us down to 14, and I'll explain exactly why that happens in a moment. Then some really innovative process engineering and electrical engineering work that's been done for us by Crondall. We saw a way to more than halve those emissions by optimizing heat management and power generation systems. And then adding that floating wind turbine brought us down to our 2.6 kilograms of CO2 equivalent, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, an eighth of the North Sea average. So, you know, going for polymer flood, halved emissions, innovative engineering, halved emissions again, and electrifying with a wind turbine, halved emissions again. And we didn't see an advantage in going to the grid because the grid is not emissions free. We made an estimate of where we thought the grid might get to. And this option here of tying into the grid from year 2 of development ended up with pretty much the same number in terms of emissions, but cost an awful lot more. So let me just explain why polymer flood really helps you reduce emissions with a viscous oil. Pretty soon I'm going to hand over to Joel to explain things, but you've got me for a little moment longer. This is the production profile we came up with for the water flood. If you remember that core, the water fingers through the oil and leaves most of it behind. To water flood a viscous oil, the key is actually your fluid handling capacity. So we were looking at a scheme that had 250,000 barrels a day of fluid handling capacity. That was going to produce about 25, 30,000 barrels a day on plateau, but it would be a long extended profile and we'd be pumping a huge volume of fluid around the reservoir to get a decent recovery. And this recovery was only around about 60 million barrels. The polymer flood, the fluid handling is massively reduced. We're down at 100,000 barrels a day of total fluid handling capacity, and we get actually a higher peak, a quicker peak, and there's not a long tail on this production. And what we've done here is we've plotted this information in a slightly different way. So what we've plotted here is water injected versus oil recovered. And you can see, you follow this curve here, and it's a long, slow grind as you pump more and more water around the system. With polymer, the fluid handling requirements are much reduced, the field life's much shorter, you get your oil out with much less energy. And it's the energy that is the driver of the CO2 emissions. So pumping wells, injecting fluids, those are the key drivers of CO2 emissions. And polymer use really significantly enhances project economics and minimizes the environmental impact. So this is what our baseline polymer scheme looked like. You'll see a few of these slides. I'll explain them quickly. What we have on the left-hand side is power demand in kilowatts. So, we're looking at 17, 18 megawatts of power demand, mostly to feed the systems on the FPSO. We intended, or still intend, to electrify the jackup rig. So that's the pink demand. And then these two blocks of green demand are the downhole pumps on the two wellhead platforms. And that power demand translates into this green block of power generation emissions. But we also needed quite a lot of process heat in the system that we were evaluating here. Here we were relying on electrostatic separators running at 140 degrees centigrade. So there's a lot of process heat requirements. And those two together, plus whatever there is from flaring, make up the Scope 1 emissions. And then Scope 3 emissions are these supply chain emissions. So this is transportation of oil to the refinery, the pale yellow, and the orange is actually the logistics, the supply boats. So we significantly reduced our emissions relative to a water flood, but we thought we could do a lot better. So we engaged Crondall to give us a hand, and at this point, Joel gets his chance to take you through the story.
All right, brilliant. Thanks, Steve. So yeah, I'm going to sort of provide a bit of background to why we focused on reducing the emissions. So, and then I'm going to provide you with a couple of examples of technology we've applied for the pilot field, and get into sort of a bit of the detail, which is going to, for me, the fun bit. So first off, we've all seen over the last few years that there's been this real push for the energy transition, and this really culminated for our industry in our basin with the OGA's latest stewardship expectation, which required us to dramatically reduce our carbon footprint, or risk losing our social license to operate. And what that meant is that by 2030, we've got to reduce our emissions in the basin by 50%, and by 2040 by 90%. So that means that all new facilities can't just look at their current emissions for day one. They've got to be future-proof to bring down their emissions to achieve those targets of 50 and 90% reduction. If you go to the next slide, please, Steve. So Crondall is supporting their clients through the energy transition, and there's multiple ways that we're doing this. And firstly, what we're looking at is assessing the emissions from a development. So those are the graphs that Steve showed you earlier. So looking at what are your bad actors, and where can we make the biggest impact to reduce your emissions. The next part that we look at is looking at benchmarking those emissions. So looking at other facilities within the basin, the wider industry, and other similar field types. So as Steve was showing you with the viscous oil developments. Then looking at how we take the existing facility and make it lower emissions. So we look at an iterative design where we pick out those bad actors, those greatest contribution to emissions, and look at alternative solutions. And the solutions I'm going to present you in a second, they're all proven designs. They're used in a slightly different application. So utilizing heat pumps, which are well used within the process industry, but we're applying them offshore, is a prime example. The next step we look at is the net zero roadmap. So what we look at here is that getting to that objective of zero emissions from offshore facilities. So with the pilot field, we've looked at power import, we've looked at post-combustion carbon capture, and making sure that design is future-proofed so that when those technologies are suitably mature, we can incorporate them within the facility without major brownfield mods, which would ruin project economics. Steve, go to the next slide, please. So the basis for our assessment is our Zeta tool, our zero emissions tracking and assessment tool. And what this tool does is it assesses the full life cycle emissions for a facility. So that is your scope 1, which are direct emissions, scope 2, your indirect emissions from imported energy, so that could be steam, power, and then scope 3, which is supply chain and subcontracted work. And we estimate the emissions from construction through to operation, including installation. And what we do is we utilize that and we create a base estimate. So as Steve showed those graphs there, your base emissions estimate. What we then look at is, what are your bad actors? What are the items within your design that are contributing most to those emissions? We then perform a technology and system design review, where we look at how we can utilize existing technology to reduce those emissions. And we then perform a re-benchmark of, re-evaluation of the facility, utilizing the Zeta tool to understand what reduction we've got. And we then follow an iterative process where we keep picking out those bad actors and reducing them as far as practical to achieve the reductions we require for the net zero basin that the OGA are delivering. And the final piece of the puzzle really for developing these facilities is looking to the future. The design so far is really focused on what we can do now, but we then look towards the future and we look at, okay, what are the emerging technologies that the facility is going to need to leverage to achieve the 90% reduction and the net zero objective for the basin. And so that can be things like we say, like carbon capture, that can be power import. There's a number of different options available. Steve, if you go to the next slide, please. Right, so we talked a lot about how we sort of go through the process and why we're doing it, but what does that actually mean? You know, as an industry, we've become really focused on maximizing production efficiency, and that's really great. And really what we're doing here with CO2 emissions is just changing how we view that, because when we're maximizing our production efficiency, we're trying to minimize power consumption. We're trying to make sure we minimize flaring, because all of that increases for example, the gas that we can export. So what we're doing is reassessing the design of our facilities through the lens of CO2 emissions reduction. And there's 5 key areas that we focus on for that. The first one is the big one, is around electrification and electrical architecture. For the majority of facilities, your biggest contribution to operational emissions is your power generation. So there we looked at alternative generation technology, so we increase generation efficiency. And we also look at power import options as well. The next one, which Steve's mentioned, is energy use optimization. So this is around the process heat. So making the whole process design more energy efficient. We're a bit addicted to process heat as an industry. We kind of get it for free with our simple cycle gas turbines. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't come for free from the perspective of CO2 emissions. So we need to look at how we can reduce that waste heat demand throughout the process, so that we can leverage the more efficient generators that have less of that process heat available, or a lower grade of that process heat available. And we'll talk about a couple of those generators in a second. The next part is looking at process technologies, and this really links into the energy optimization. So it's looking at the process design and not just taking the way we've always done things, but looking at how we can use proven technology and make modifications to improve the energy efficiency and improve our throughput. So as Steve was saying, trying to maximize the production in a shorter period, as that helps reduce your overall emissions over the field life. Flaring as a basin, we are very good at. You know, industry best practice is now for a closed flare with recovery units. And then finally is looking to the future, is looking at carbon capture. And that's really focusing on post-combustion carbon capture. If electrification isn't an option in terms of power import, we're looking at, okay, how can we use carbon capture to capture the exhaust emissions from our power generation? If you go to the next slide, please. Right, so the interesting bit, we're going to talk about a bit of the process technology now. So what we've got up here is a very basic flow diagram for the pilot field, and you'll notice it is quite different from a traditional facility. What we've done is it's built around the wash tank technology, which you see at the top right, and that's replacing traditional separation. And there's a few reasons for that. The overall aim is to dewater the oil at a lower temperature. So that talks to that improving the energy efficiency of the process. And the way we do that is by using the wash tank technology, we increase the residence time for separation. We also use phase inversion to increase the water cup to improve the knockout of water in that phase. The next technology we look at within this flow diagram is around heat recovery. So if you look at technologies 5 and 4, all of that is focused on maximizing heat recovery. So a lot of the time we spend a lot of time in oil and gas heating things up and then cooling them down and not trying to recover any of that energy. So what we're looking at here instead is we're using heat pumps wherever we can to maximize the energy recovering. So on the inlet, technology 5 here, any seawater that we're lifting, we're utilizing a heat pump to take that energy from a low grade to a higher grade, so we can preheat the well fluids coming into the degasser. Once it's gone through the degasser and we're going through the fluids booster pumps off to the wash tanks, we're then using a heat exchanger at that point to again heat the fluids prior to going into the degasser. Again, it's all about maximizing heat recovery from the process itself. And finally, on the bottom right, we've also looked at some energy. We also are applying some energy recovery systems within the overall pilot facility. And some of these are small and some of these are larger. The system you see on the bottom right is focused on the reverse osmosis systems we have on board. We need a lot of fresh water on board for the polymer flooding. And so as part of that, we're looking at devices that can recover energy from that process. And this is one of them, the PX Energy solution. If you could go to the next slide, please. Okay. Personally, this is one of the things I find most exciting about the pilot develop is around the power generation. Offshore, we almost exclusively use simple cycle gas turbines, where we're getting around a 30 to 35% efficiency, depending on how old that machine is. And then we're using the waste heat from that for process design. Now, as we said before, if we've changed the process such that we've reduced our process heat demand, we can look at more efficient alternatives. So we can look at combined cycle gas turbines, and a combined cycle gas turbine, all that does is use the waste heat and uses that to turn a steam turbine generator to generate additional electricity. And then you've also got your reciprocating engines, which you see in the top left, which again is a more efficient engine, giving you that higher overall efficiency. The key decision here for the pilot field was between a combined cycle gas turbine and a reciprocating engine. The key difference is that the reciprocating engine provides you with some waste heat. It's a lot less than a simple cycle gas turbine, but it provides you with some, and that was sufficient to supplement our process heat within the pilot design. So the selection for the pilot field is for reciprocating engines. We get an improved efficiency over an offshore variant of a combined cycle gas turbine. We're provided with waste heat, which we can utilize to supplement our process heat that we require, which overall reduces our emissions for the complete facility. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a graph that compares the different efficiencies and emissions per kilowatt hour. Steve, if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. Oh, and I think I'm handing back to you here.
Yeah. So Crondall did all that work for us, looking at the power generation efficiency and the process heat management, and that actually reduced our overall electrical power demand to around about 15 megawatts, and our scope 1 emissions were down to 5.9 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. Mostly that's for power generation. There was still a little bit of process heat requirement, but we've more than halved emissions through engineering innovation and adapting technologies that are used widely elsewhere and putting them into our process design. And it's actually, the thing is, you have to do all these things in parallel. You get the benefit when you combine heat pumps with high efficiency generation. if you have low efficiency generation, there's plenty of spare heat around, so it's not such a big deal. And so you have to drive down your energy demand in the first instance, and that a key part of that is wash tanks. But then this engineering innovation helped drive that further. But we wanted to do better again. So we talked to Floating Power Plant, who have a design for a floating wind turbine, which is targeted on exactly the sort of site that we have. It's a semi-submersible floating wind turbine. It also has a couple of megawatts of wave generation capacity, which helps maintain the uptime of the unit, because often the waves will continue to roll, perhaps when the wind has dropped somewhat. And we found that we can make use of a lot of energy from the system. And the benefit we got from adding this floating wind turbine was that we were able to drop a gas import pipeline, because our development was energy deficient. We didn't have enough associated gas to meet the entire energy demand. And by dropping that gas import pipeline and the cost of importing the gas, that actually meant that we were able to add this floating wind turbine without hurting the economics in any way. And the addition of that local renewable power got us down to 2.6 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. We can actually do better again. If we installed a second wind turbine, we'd get down to 1.4 kilograms of CO2 per barrel. But actually, the cost of abatement there is $500 a ton. And it would actually be much better for us to focus on some of these scope 3 emissions than necessarily trying to get to absolute purity or the lowest possible value on the scope 1 emissions. So we haven't really addressed that question yet. How do we address it? It's by initiatives in the supply chain. It's actually the operators of the shuttle tankers, the operators of the supply vessels who will find a way to address that. But we think there's definitely opportunities to further reduce emissions. So, we think we've done a good job. What's this like in a global context? Well, we found a very interesting paper published in 2018 by Maisey et al., which attempted to quantify emissions per unit of energy from the world's oil production system. And what they did is they looked at, I think, 3,000 different field units that account for 80 million barrels per day of supply. So that's roughly 80% of the world's supply. And they went through that and estimated the emissions in scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 up to the refinery gate. So if you look at the widest definition of scope 3, that would also include emissions from combustion of the fuel. But this paper was focused on the whole production process. So they were estimating emissions from the well to the refinery gate. And to be compatible with the Stanford University data set, we had to add in some scope 3 emissions and estimates of emissions during the exploration and development phases. We used the Stanford tool to do that. And then we had to change units because, of course, they'd done this in a different set of units. This time, the units are grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And when you take our 2.64 kilograms of CO2 per barrel, add in scope 3, convert the units, you end up with 1.4 grams of CO2 equivalent per megajoule. And this puts us at the low end of the lowest 5% of global oil production, despite Pilot being a viscous oil field that everybody says is high emissions. Why do they say viscous oil fields are high emissions? It's because mostly heavy oil fields are high emissions. All these red and orange bars are heavy oil fields, and these are steam flood developments in Venezuela and Canada and so on and so forth. But you don't have to be high emissions. The world is going to need oil for a long time. it's going to need organic energy, as I like to call it, for a very long time. And we're going to need oil for lubricants and other sources. So we want to make sure that we're delivering our oil in the lowest emissions way possible. And I think with our pilot development scheme, we've managed to do that. So that's all I was going to say. I'm open to questions. I haven't been keeping track of the questions yet, but perhaps I'll hand back to Kareem to be the moderator for that.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Joel. That was a very interesting presentation. And I have to say a very timely presentation, as well, as our industry is working very hard to tackle our Scope 1 emissions. As it stands, our 2020 Scope 1 emissions was around 17 million tons. So the challenge is there to drive that down to zero by 2050. Perfect. So we are now in the process of doing the Q&A session. So I'm just going to quickly see if we have any questions. But if you do have a question, then feel free to enter it in the chat box or raise your hand, and you can ask your question verbally.
Hey, probably while the other questions comes up, Kareem, I have a question for Steve. Hey, Steve, first of all, an excellent presentation. Hey, my question, Steve, is the carbon emissions that you have shown, which is basically almost 1/6 of the industry average, right? The 2.6 tons of CO2 per barrel. What are the lessons of that particular exercise, or at least from the pilot field development, that you can kind of everybody should think to apply to the existing fields right now? Because most of the fields are now mature, and some of that would be difficult to apply some of the concepts that you have already applied here. But are there any lessons that you want to share? Or are there any areas that you want to share that can be easily applied to the other fields to get benefit out of? Or can you share some thoughts around that?
I'll certainly share some thoughts. The first thing I'd say is that there's nothing easy you can do. It is really an awful lot easier to reshape your process design on paper than it is when it's in metal. You know, when you're a new development, you have a big opportunity to get it right from the outset. And what you need to do is you need to be open to some new technologies. You need to be open to existing technologies being applied in different places. And the other thing I would say is it's a good idea not to be obsessed about purity. Don't let a drive for purity stop you getting easy wins. You know, when we add up the cost of reducing these emissions over the whole life of the field development, it's actually only about $19 million to abate a million tons of CO2. That's a massively lower number than you're facing whenever you're looking at trying to abate emissions from an existing field. But you know, if you want to have 100% renewable, that's a bit of a holy grail. You know, it's much easier to get maybe 80% renewable and 20% from a gas backup. That's practical, that's proven, that's something you can do today. It's much better to get on and do it today than it is to wait for nirvana.
Hey, thanks, Steve. Kareem, I think we have one question from,
So Graham Dallas has posted a comment and question. So great to see the data, knowledge gained, and experience from the captain field. Is Ithaca open with sharing data?
So in the past, Chevron have actually published a lot of papers on the work they've done on the captain field before they handed over to Ithaca as operator. We've had a number of meetings with Ithaca and talked about what we're doing, and we absolutely listen to anything they say. very intently, because there's often a clue in there of where you can have some difficulties, you know. So, but a lot of that was actually published by Chevron in the 2018, 2019, 2020 period, before they transferred operatorship to Ithaca. I haven't actually seen a publication from Ithaca lately, but they've certainly been open to talking to us.
All right. We have another question in the chat window coming from David King. Who do you think need to take responsibility for spreading the word that challenging oil can be developed with low CO2 strategy? Is this for OGA? Steve, you want to pick it up?
Well, I think the answer to that is obviously we all do, right? So yes, the OGA should be saying that, and we should be saying it, and the SPE should be saying it, and Oil and Gas UK should be saying it. So I think it's the responsibility is with us all to say, actually, you know, this may be quite a challenging field, but if you approach it in the right way, this can be a very low emissions development, and absolutely in line with both of the OGA's objectives, maximizing economic recovery and delivering a net zero basin.
Perfect. We have another question from Richard Barrett. So are there any implications with respect to oil and water separation at surface when using polymer flood technology?
So the biggest issue is actually in cleaning up the water. And this is where, once again, being a new development, we have a big advantage. So whenever Chevron decided to polymer flood on Captain, they already had gas flotation units and hydrocyclones in the water treatment system. And the approach they took to try and make that system still work was to make sure that the polymer was degraded as they went through their hydraulic submersible pumps on Captain, and reduce the viscosity of the produced fluids so that it would those hydrocyclones and gas flotation units would work. We're going to take a different approach. We actually want to preserve the viscosity of the water, because that reduces the amount of polymer you have to add when you re-inject it, and you have to re-inject it all. You'd never put this over the side. And we've gone to one of two filtration technologies. One's from a firm called Maisey, one from Siemens called Performedia, and they operate a bit like walnut shell filters, but they give you very good water cleanup without destroying the viscosity of the water.
Thanks, Steve. We have another question from Mel Dow. Do you need heating in the wash or cargo tanks to maintain the temperature for separation because of the viscosity reasons? Would that call for an ESP or a HSP? Are they required? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's really two separate questions. One about heating the wash and cargo tanks. I mean, we come out of the degasser at 90 degrees centigrade. We want to go into the wash tanks at, I think, 45 degrees centigrade. Correct me if I'm wrong, Joel. And we'll keep the oil in the cargo tanks warm because it just makes it a bit easier to handle. So there will be some element of heating in the cargo tanks, but really we won't be adding heat. It's just maintaining a temperature.
Yeah.
In terms of artificial lift, that's actually, there's a whole other presentation on artificial lift. Right. So we've decided to select a pump called the V pump from a company called Veritech. It's a counter-rotating helical axial pump. I can't say that. That was too hard to say. And it was originally designed for high viscosity wells. And the big difference between it and the centrifugal stages you get in ESPs and hydraulic submersible pumps is that it remains efficient at much higher viscosities. It operates actually at 13% efficiency at 13,000 centipoise. So If you look at the efficiency curve for a centrifugal stage, if you're up above 1,000 centipoise, you got bugger all, efficiency. So that's a really important question. Obviously, we need artificial lift, but selecting the right artificial lift approach is absolutely critical. And the good thing about the V pump is it's been deployed very widely in the States because it turned out to be really good at handling sand. So a typical ESP will fail after you put a ton of sand through it. There is one of these V pumps that has pumped 80 tons of sand through it. And there's been 400 of these pumps deployed in, unconventional wells in the States that are flowing back a lot of sand after a big frac job.
Thanks, Steve. We have a question from Juan Carlos Santivanes. So thank you for the presentation. Although emissions in certain countries are being reduced according to the Kyoto Agreement, not all companies in oil and gas are working on that. Is there a global proposal between companies to share these reduction commitments?
I think answering that is probably above my pay grade. This is an intergovernmental issue, a multinational company talking to multinational company, national company issue. We're an independent. We're just trying to do things the best we can.
We have another question. It's an anonymous here. Indeed, thanks for the presentation. Do you know what assumption you would have on the uptime of the wind wave turbine? How does this affect the overall production efficiency of the development?
So for a 12 megawatt wind turbine and 2 megawatts of wave power, over a year that'll generate 77.7 gigawatt hours of electricity if there's no curtailment. And because our demand is above 14 megawatts, there is no curtailment. So that actually equates to 63% uptime, or 63% of 14 megawatts times 365 days times 24 hours. So that we always have the backup running in our case. So the gas turbine, the gas reciprocating engines will always be generating power. And when the wind declines, we'll just put more gas into those systems. So the intention is to have a very responsive and reliable system. And we're actually including a battery in the system, isn't that right, Joel?
Yeah, so just a little bit on this one. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the sort of assumptions for the wind and wave, we looked at this a couple of ways. So there's some great data out there available from the OGA on a wind site that is just next door to Pilot, which is brilliant. So we've used that, but we've also had the vendor of the units also perform their own analysis from their data sets. Both were remarkably similar with the numbers that Steve's just presented. Now, in terms of the production efficiency, we're still targeting the usual oil and gas kind of 99% uptime. And the way we do that is by having that, in effect, spinning reserve that Steve mentions, but we're doing that a little bit smarter. So we utilize a battery. And what that does is provide us with 15 minutes of power so that we can start up that generator when required. So we aren't emitting there are no emissions when that generator is offline, and we can utilize all the energy we can get from the wind turbine and then use that battery to give us the time to start up the generator without impacting operations.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm mindful of time, so we have time for one more question. So I think this is from John Little. Is the size of polymer droplets a key factor in cleaning up the water? And are you using low shear design pumps and valves?
So it's not really a phenomenon of polymer droplets, except there is. So it is an interesting question. The polymer comes wrapped in an oil-based. It's a bubble of polymer in an oil emulsion. But when you mix it with the water, then you distribute the polymer molecules throughout the water, and they're pretty high molecular weight, 20 to 40 million, I think. I can't remember. I'm quoting a number and I'm not remembering it properly, so ignore that. And what Chevron do to clean up their water, or Chevron did, and now I think I do, is they try to break up those molecules. So it's not really droplets, it's molecules. They're trying to break up the molecules, make them smaller, and then that reduces the viscosity of the water. We want to preserve that. So, one of the reasons we went to the V pump for the downhole pump is it's a lower shear environment. And when we're pumping fluid around the system, we're much more likely to be using, say, twin screw pumps rather than centrifugal pumps, so that we're not actually putting a lot of disruption into the system. Have we cut off here? The valves. It's important after you've mixed the polymer with the water, any valve downstream of that has to be a low shear valve. But we've structured our design so that we don't have any valves downstream of that. So we don't even need the low shear valve. We have static mixers on a flow line going to each and every well, so we can actually optimize the viscosity by injection well, and we have no valves in the system between wellhead and sand face.
Perfect. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Joel. And that's it for the session. It's 1 o'clock now. Thank you, Steve and Joel, for that very insightful presentation. And as we mentioned at the start of the session, the recording of today's session will be available on our website and YouTube page as well. And just to give you a final reminder, we do have a few more net zero sessions coming up over the next few months. So please keep an eye out for the registrations. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. And we plan future activities based on what the SPE members want to see and hear. So please engage with us and let us know what you want. But otherwise, thanks Steve and Joel for the fantastic session. And thanks everyone for joining.